You could get a soap opera out of Hosea's life, a cheating wife, an angry husband, the children of the marriage victimized between them. Hosea should have known better. The woman he married was not known for fidelity, but he felt it was a rather symbolic marriage, as Hosea was a prophet. He looked at the people of Israel and felt they were as faithless to God as a harlot wife would be, so he married her. So he got exactly what he deserved and expected. His wife slept around so much she was out more often than she was home. Hosea is a decent sort. He hangs on to the marriage, but he isn't happy about the situation. He took some prophetic bullseyes through their children. He named one Not My People. Another one he named Not Pity. The third he called Jezreel. Jezreel is a place where a traitor had killed the king. Imagine those poor kids. Not only did Hosea's personal life stink, but he had troubles with his boss, the Lord Almighty. With a rather unenviable career of prophet, he didn't doubt that Israel had earned another Sodom and Gomorrah scene. Now that would be a true end-of-the-season cliffhanger for even a primetime show. Back on the home front, Hosea's wife finally runs off with several men and has a jolly old time. Rumors get back to Hosea about it all. He's filled with wrath. It figures God has got to feel the same way about Israel. And so we're all poised for the scene that they might have to get Cecil B. DeMille back from the grave to film. End of the season. The next season premieres when the prophet hears his wife is alone. She's been deserted by her so-called friends. Dissipation has killed her looks. The few louses still hanging around figure on grabbing a few bucks by selling her to the highest bidder. We're waiting for DeMille to show up. Fire and brimstone will rain on Israel while Hosea chortles his wife is sold into slavery. Wait a minute. What's this? Was DeMille too busy to film? Was the special effects department out to lunch? Couldn't Hosea pull off a decent revenge scene? There he is. He's not chortling. In fact, those look like tears in his eyes. He can't stand it. This is his wife. He loves her despite everything. He buys her from her friends. He takes her home and nurses her back to health. And he loves her, and she even seems to love him. It dawns on Hosea that if he can be loving and forgiving, then God, who is after all God, is currently going to be even more so. It's not a traditional soap opera. Hosea understood love, the disappointment of love. He knew anger, and he knew what it meant to forgive and redeem. The 11th chapter in his book doesn't talk about his marital problems, but we can see the same dynamic expressed. In this chapter, God's relationship with the people is spoken of in terms of parenting. When Israel was a child, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son. As Jesus taught us to do, we also think of God in terms of parenthood. There's God's care for us as little children, God's patience and guidance as we fumbled our way towards moral understanding. I once attended a workshop where the leader told us that when we had learned to tell the story of one person who had had a beneficial effect on our lives, we could go on to tell what God had done in our lives. And yet several of us felt that telling such a story was telling what God had done, because God acts through people. The book of Hosea expresses the same truth. I led them with cords of human kindness, with bands of love. I was to them like those who lift infants to their cheeks. What a picture. Infants receive love. They don't always know who's giving that love, and it's only later that they learn to differentiate. I took them up in my arms, Hosea said, but they did not know that I healed them. Many people of Israel had forgotten the power behind the love. They looked for other sources of power. They did not live out the love in their own lives. And their lives were distorted because they had turned away from God. To read the book of Hosea is to see a tragic picture of a people who have lost their way. Even when they turn to God, it is only for brief moments before going back to their rut. They were no different than society today, where our Baals are money, power, fame, success, and even success on things like social media, where people seem to base some of their self-image on how many likes or whatever they get. The sword also rages in our cities. Our schemes are also found to be shabby and worthless. Many people have believed it is time for DeMille to pull out your cameras. Hosea spoke of God's anger about the situation. Now, in the United Methodist Church, I think we're not too comfortable talking about God's anger, or even the anger of anyone that we'd like to consider saintly and good. We're a trifle uncomfortable to hear that even Jesus was sometimes angry, as when he drove the money changers out of the temple. As a society, we tend to view anger as negative, counterproductive, and it's with good reason, because we've seen the terrible effects of anger. As people of faith, we usually find it much more comfortable to concentrate on God's love, compassion, tenderness, forgiveness, except in those traditions that believe it's going to be directed at all the other people. I mean, there are traditions they don't think any of it's going to come to them. It's all going to go at other people. So there are traditions, religious traditions, that do emphasize it for that reason. God is love, though. 1 John tells us that. The nature of God is to love. It's not because we are lovable, it's because God is love. It's easier to skip over the part where we're told of God's anger. I certainly do not believe in trying to frighten people into faith, but to ignore expressions of divine anger is unfair to the biblical story, and it's unfair to God. Anger has a place in the scriptural story, not only in this one, but in many others. Anger is a normal and regular part of life. Is it always a bad thing? Well, what should we call it when we see injustice or suffering, when we see persons destroying themselves and other people, when we know there are persons who see the same things and still walk away in indifference? It infuriates me to know there are dope peddlers selling drugs to children. I'm outraged that there are people, including parents, who hurt kids. I'm horrified by the fact that there are parents who've done everything possible, and yet their kids still turn away from them. I'm deeply upset that people kill each other. In the name of God, even, they kill each other. It offends me there are people who are oppressed, starving, or diseased. I'm enraged that prejudice still exists and even seems to be on the rise. I get frustrated when I see so much pettiness and deceit and wrong. Call it whatever we like. There should be strong emotions when we see such terrible things. And some of that emotion is appropriately directed at ourselves, not to be directed all at other people. To avoid self-righteousness, we must keep ourselves aware that we are not always a part of the solution. We are sometimes part of the problem. What are we supposed to call it when God sees these things? Surely God must be filled with a terrible and holy rage. How could God be loving and not be angry with what we've done to the world and to each other? We do religion and faith a disservice when we take anger out of it, when we try to make faith a thing of mild and fuzzy feelings. Yes, all anger should be let go of at the proper time. We should be especially careful of petty anger, revengeful anger, anger that becomes more of a mood than anything else. And if our anger is based on our violations of self-righteousness or selfishness or self-centeredness, our sense of position or things like that, then our anger doesn't have a valid base. If we're angry because people don't agree with us or have different ideas, and we're just being arrogant. But if our anger is based upon our sense that justice, mercy, and kindness are important, and that these have been violated, then strong emotion may be appropriate. Whatever it is we call it, the term doesn't matter. It's not the anger itself, though, that's the culprit. It's how we handle our anger. And that's why wisdom is so justly cautious of anger, because humans are very bad at handling it. Now in Hosea, it doesn't say that God stopped being angry. It says, I will not execute my first anger. I will not again destroy. I will not come in wrath. Instead, God proposed to use that anger to roar like a lion, to bring the children in so they could be returned to their home. This is the way anger should be handled in redemption and forgiveness. God says, I am God, not man. The grieving, hurting, angry God acts out of compassion and redeems the people. The message of Hosea is ultimately one of love. It's a message of grace and forgiveness. It's a story of transformation. We see the doves will fly eagerly home. Because God is angry and uses the anger with love, the people will be redeemed. As Christians, we're most familiar with another aspect of God's grief and anger. God's grief became more than the roaring of a lion to call the people home. The anger became more than a little, what it did was became a little child in a manger bed, a boy working in a carpenter shop, a man teaching along the roadside, a man on a cross. What an amazing way to say, I'm angry with you, because it was also the way God said, I love you. Amen.